Degataga Wolf woke up to a beautiful spring morning on the day of his 70th birthday, and he knew that it was his day to die. He wasn't sick. In fact, he worked hard to stay in what most people would call excellent shape, especially for an old man. Other than the many scars that tattooed his body, he looked to be decades younger. However, if anyone were to ever hear the stories of how he had obtained these injuries, they would think that he had lost his mind. But Degataga was sane, and the injuries had come from saving the townsfolk of Nevermore Hollows from destruction and death. He had done this 5 times previously. Each time he came away victorious, but with more scars and broken bones. Degataga was Cherokee. His ancestors had lived in the area now known as Nevermore Hollows for centuries. When he was a small child, his grandmother would tell him stories of the ways and the beliefs of his people. One of those stories was about Asgoli. Not long after the Europeans showed up in ships and settled the area, a terrible famine ravaged the land. Both the settlers and the Cherokee were starving, dying. A young Cherokee brave named Asgoli believed that the famine was a curse caused by the settlers and thought that by slaughtering them, the curse would be lifted and the land would heal. There were 2 elders, which consisted of the chief and an old woman who was the tribe's shaman. The elders did not believe the famine to be caused by the settlers and instructed Asgoli to trust in the spirits to heal the land. The young brave thought that the elders were weak, and in the middle of the night he snuck into their tents and cut off their heads. He tied their heads together with a rope and took them to the river wherein he planned to toss them. However, he slipped on the muddy bank, got tangled with the rope, and fell into the river and drowned. But his spirit was so corrupt, so evil, so committed to its erroneous way of thinking that every 10 years at midnight, it would emerge from the river and seek to rid the land of any non-indigenous people. Asgoli was free to roam the countryside until the sun peaked above the horizon. The ghastly heads floated about him at the end of the rope as he sought to pour out his rage. The chief's head was wearing his war bonnet, which resembled a halo of feathers. His face was painted red and black. His eyes were milky orbs, and his mouth constantly chewed the air as if hungry for flesh. The shaman's face was painted like a skull. She wore a crown of antlers that seemed to claw at the air around her. Degataga's grandmother told him that the men in his bloodline had stood against the evil spirit of the young brave, always beating him back into the river, thus saving the townsfolk, except for one terrible night. On that night, Asgoli had slain the warrior who stood against him and had swept down upon the small town of Nevermore Hollows, slaughtering most of the townsfolk. Only 3 families had been spared because it had taken Asgoli most of the night to defeat the Cherokee warrior who had stood against him. He had simply run out of time before dawn. And then Degataga's grandmother had given him his own destiny. She said that upon his 20th birthday, he would be the next in line to take up the fight against Asgoli. She told him that he must do what the others had not been able to do. He must kill Asgoli. To do that, he had to somehow take Asgoli's knife from him and use it to sever his head. Only then would Nevermore Hollows be safe. Degataga was the last of his bloodline, though he had taken a wife. She had been beautiful, a Cherokee girl named Hialeah. He had loved her with a passion that rivaled history's great love stories. They had married 6 months before his 30th birthday, which was also 6 months before he would fight Asgoli for the second time. Degataga had beaten Asgoli during their first battle, and he had been too confident in his own abilities, his head filled with the arrogance of a young warrior, and he had become careless. He wanted his beautiful Hialeah to witness his prowess in battle. So, he took her with him to the river on the night that Asgoli was to appear, and in his overconfidence, he did not see that Asgoli had let go of the rope that held the heads, and they had attacked his young wife. They entangled Hialeah in their rope. She tripped and fell to the ground, screaming for Degataga to help, but he was locked in a hand-to-hand combat with Asgoli and couldn't get loose. The heads fell upon her, chewing at her arms, gnawing at her face, and ultimately ripping out her throat. The last word she ever uttered was Degataga's name in a gurgling scream. Degataga had been humbled in a way only the death of a loved one can accomplish. He had buried her on the highest hill in the area under a dogwood tree. She had loved dogwoods for their elegant flowers in the spring and their delicate leaves in the summer. The tree served as a fitting marker for the grave of his beloved Hialeah, and he would often sit beneath it and listen to the wind whisper her name through the branches. After her death, his battle with Asgoli was now personal. He had sworn to do what his ancestors had never been able to do. He would not stop at simply pushing Asgoli back into the river and holding him off until sunrise. He would kill Asgoli, thus sparing the town forever and getting revenge for his beautiful Hialeah. He had thus far been unsuccessful, and tonight was his last opportunity to do so. So he bathed, ate his last meal, gathered his weapons, and headed off into Dunwich Forest to the river where Asgoli lived. Dunwich Forest was dense and murky, with only occasional arrows of light piercing the canopy. The forest seemed to writhe with its own dark spirit. Upon entering the forest, Degataga felt the tentacles of that dark spirit slither at the edges of his soul. But Degataga's spirit was one of light, and the tentacles recoiled as if afraid of what they had touched. He gave a grim smile and pushed further into the forest. A couple hours later, he climbed a ridge and looked down upon the river below. It looked like a thick black serpent slithering through the dense vegetation. He scrambled down and sat at the river's edge, waiting for midnight, which was when Asgoli would rise from the river's depths and try to make his assault on the townsfolk. While he waited, he recalled the words of Jesus, who said that the greatest act of love is that one would lay down his life for others. These words gave him strength. After a while, the shafts of light were no longer from the sun, but from the full moon. It was almost time. He opened his backpack and removed the weapons he had chosen for this final battle. The first was a tomahawk made from a sacred stone that had fallen from the sky. It was so black that it seemed as if it were made from shadows. The second was a dream catcher. Its net was woven from the hair of an angel. From it hung the crisp white feathers of an albino crow. He hung the dream catcher around his neck, letting it fall over the center of his chest. He held the tomahawk in his right hand and squatted on the bank, his eyes scanning the black water. Suddenly, there was movement in the center of the river, and Asgoli slowly rose from the water as he walked toward the shore. In his right hand, he held the large hunting knife he had used to murder the elders. In his left hand, he held the rope, to which the two heads were tied. The heads floated waist high. The chief's head glared at Degataga with its milky eyes, its mouth chewing the air, hungry for Degataga's flesh. The feathers of its war bonnet slithered behind it on the surface of the black water. The shaman's withered, skull-painted face leered at him, her crown of antlers seeming like skeletal claws. Degataga stood, gripping the tomahawk tightly. Though the sight before him was ghastly, he was not afraid. He had fought Asgoli too many times now to be gripped by fear. Though he had always come away with serious, sometimes life-threatening injuries, he had also learned something from every one of those battles. One of the lessons he learned was that Asgoli was in essence a river demon. The river healed him. That's why he escaped back to it after each battle. And tonight, Degataga had devised a strategy to lure Asgoli far enough away from the river so that he could not escape. Asgoli was a terrible sight to behold. His long black hair fell across his shoulders in two thick braids that glistened with river muck. He was naked except for a loincloth and moccasins. Around his neck curled a snake, its head hanging down over his heart. His skin was greased in a film of slime, and his eyes gave off a hateful crimson glow. His mouth split open into an impossibly wide smile, revealing a mouthful of sharp teeth.
"You're an old man now,"
he said. His voice was thick and had a slight gurgle, as if his throat was full of river water. Asgoli took 3 confident steps closer, and Degataga retreated 4. "With age comes wisdom," Degataga replied. "Tonight, all this will be over." Asgoli gurgled a laugh.
"That's because tonight I will cut off your head and add it to my collection. Then I will slaughter every single person in that town, just like I did your wife."
He took another long step toward Degataga. The heads that had been floating at his waist rose up above his head, still tethered to his wrist by the rope. The chief's head bobbled angrily, its mouth chewing. The shaman's head had her milky eyes fixed upon Degataga, as if sizing him up. Degataga took another step back. They were now 15 yards from the river's bank, and neither Asgoli or the dreadful floating head seemed to take notice of the tomahawk and his dream catcher. Suddenly, the chief's head shot forward, stopping only when the rope snapped taut. It hovered 3 feet from Degataga, its mouth chewing the air, hungry for Degataga's flesh. Degataga shot back and swung the tomahawk, but the chief's head bobbled away. While he was distracted, the shaman's head lunged at him, her skeleton-painted face grinning with evil intent. She chomped down on his shoulder, and pain shot down through his arm and up his neck. Degataga grunted, grabbed the hag by her hair, and wrenched her free, tearing a chunk of his flesh from his shoulder. Blood flowed freely down his chest and arm. The head tried to shake free with eerie force as if attached to a phantom's body. Degataga raised the tomahawk, intending to smash it into her face, but the chief's head swirled the rope around his wrist, stopping him. Asgoli saw his chance to strike. He stepped forward and slid the blade of his hunting knife between two of Degataga's ribs. Degataga hissed in pain. He stumbled back, mad at himself for being so careless. He'd never been injured this badly so early in the fight. The only reason he didn't fall to the ground was that he was held in place by the taut rope tied to the chief's neck. Asgoli pulled the knife free and raised it high, preparing to slash. Degataga slung the shaman's head around and slammed it against Asgoli's face. The old woman cackled with rage, but it worked. The force of the blow caused Asgoli to slip on the muddy bank, falling to a knee. Degataga let go of the shaman, snatched his own hunting knife from the sheath on his belt, and stabbed it into the chief's forehead. The chief opened his mouth in rage and swirled back, releasing the rope from Degataga's arm. Now that Degataga was free to use the tomahawk, he stepped forward and brought it down onto Asgoli's head. But at the last second, Asgoli twisted away, and the tomahawk instead smashed down onto his collarbone with a sickening crunch. Degataga tried to capitalize on the moment. He raised the tomahawk for another blow, but the shaman began chanting a spell. His mind immediately became fuzzy, slowing his reaction time down, allowing Asgoli to juke to the side and slash his blade across Degataga's left thigh. Degataga knew the old woman was casting a dream spell, but the effects were diminished due to the dream catcher hanging around his neck. Asgoli was now on his feet. He strode forward, the two heads swirling above him, tethered to his wrist by the rope.
Not bad. You're still a warrior. But you can't keep this up, old man.
Asgoli was right. Degataga was losing strength. He coughed and tasted blood on his lips, a sure sign of severe internal injury. He had to act fast, use cleverness and experience to gain victory. He turned and made his way to the tree line in a stumbling run. Asgoli, sensing the moment was his to finally defeat his foe of 50 years, followed. Degataga struggled to breathe as his lungs filled with blood. He fell to the ground and raised his left arm in defense as Asgoli ran up and stood over him. The chief's head twirled down and bit Degataga's wrist. Degataga bit back a scream of pain. The shaman continued her chant, but the dream catcher was working at keeping the spell ineffective. Asgoli raised his long knife high. He brought it down, intending to slam the blade into Degataga's chest. But the old man held the tomahawk tight in his right hand and hammered it into Asgoli's left knee, shattering the bone and causing the knife to miss its mark and instead sink deep into Degataga's shoulder. Though he was in terrible pain, it was Asgoli who cried out. It was filled with rage. He let go of the knife and fell on top of Degataga, who rolled and tossed him to the side. The chief still had his teeth sunk into Degataga's arm. It began chewing through the flesh down to the bone. Degataga finally allowed a groan of agony. Then he slammed the tomahawk into the side of the chief's head, shattering the skull and leaving a ghastly hole from which black, slimy brains oozed. But the chief opened his mouth and let go of Degataga's arm. The shaman struck again, but Degataga rolled, pushing himself up, and bashed the tomahawk into the side of her face, dislocating her jaw and shattering teeth. Degataga now had the advantage. Both the heads were injured, and Asgoli was pushing himself up from the ground, favoring his broken leg. Degataga rushed him, the tomahawk held high, then brought it down with a fierce chop, lodging the sharp end deep into Asgoli's forehead. Black blood poured down his face from the wound. It flowed from his nose and mouth. His eyes glowed with confusion. Degataga had never caused such injuries as these before. Then Asgoli realized what was happening. In the past, when Asgoli sensed defeat, he was always able to escape to the river and heal. But in his arrogance tonight, he had allowed the old man to lead him far from the river, and now he had sustained mortal wounds, but Degataga was barring his way. Not that that would matter, considering his leg was broken. He also couldn't rely on the chief or the shaman because the old bastard had smashed them both, rendering them ineffective. Degataga grimaced when he yanked Asgoli's knife from his shoulder. Now, he had done what no other of his kind had been able to do. He had control of Asgoli's knife. Then, he stepped forward and said, "You will never harm the innocent, ever again." He grabbed a handful of Asgoli's hair, yanked back, exposing his neck, and used the knife to sever his head. Asgoli's body slumped to the ground, black blood spurting from the stump of his neck. The chief's head and the shaman's head dropped lifeless to the ground. Degataga held Asgoli's head up and stared into his eyes and watched as the red glow faded, leaving only black, waterlogged orbs. He grimaced and tossed the head onto the ground, then stumbled to his knees. A spasm of coughing racked his body, and blood poured over his chin and sprayed onto the grass. He was bleeding profusely from the stab wound between his ribs. Both his shoulders were severely injured, and his forearm had been chewed into a ghastly mess. He knew he had only moments left to live. He resigned himself to the idea that both he and Asgoli would become food for the beasts that roamed the dark woods. Suddenly, he caught a glow from the corner of his eyes, coming from deep within the dark woods. He was surprised to see a swarm of small orbs, each about the size of a marble, twinkling in red and blue and violet and yellow, moving in his direction. They reminded him of a string of Christmas lights, and he gave a weary smile when he realized what they were. His grandmother had told him about the pixies. They were not supernatural beings, though the few people who had ever seen them thought they were. They were simply tiny beings who preferred to stay hidden from mankind. They were neither good nor evil, though they would protect themselves with surprisingly deadly force for such small creatures. She had also told him that it was believed that they carried the souls of righteous warriors into heaven. They floated from the tree line and swarmed around him, their Christmas twinkling making the grim scene surreal. There were 20 or so of them, and 5 separated themselves and hovered over Asgoli's body. They began to pulse together in angry red. Then they swarmed around him, and a glittery red mist fell from them onto the body, which began to sizzle and disintegrate. In less than a minute, all that was left of Asgoli and the severed heads was a red goo on the dark grass. The 5 returned to the rest and began happily blinking in their various colors. Then, Degataga's eyes lost focus. His eyelids became heavy as a sense of calm washed over him. Knowing that he had laid down his life for others, he drew his last breath. The pixies hovered for a moment, their lights blinking somehow reverently. Then, through some unexplainable force, they lifted Degataga's body and carried it through the deep, dark woods, up onto a beautiful hill that was awash in moonlight, and buried him next to his sweet Hialeah under a beautiful dogwood tree.